They react to it quite strongly because they think it's replacing verified data or replacing current and existing ways of doing things. And that's not our intention at all. Our intention is very much this project augments their existing activities and is very much used as a substitute when there isn't available information or whatever it might be.
Blake Williamson. I'm the technical and content editor for the Journal of Conventional Weapons Destruction, and today I'm happy to be speaking with Jonathan Robinson and Christoph Baade, who have written about measuring explosive munitions use with open source data, a new tool for enhancing humanitarian mine action, for our upcoming anniversary issue of the journal. Their article discusses how the Carter Center's Explosive Munitions Use in Syria project uses an innovative method of data collection to better contextualize explosive munitions use on the ground in Syria. Yeah, thank you both for joining me. You all have now moved on from the Carter Center, but I'll give you just this first chance to talk a little bit about your backgrounds and how you became involved in this project and maybe where you are now.
Yeah, so I've spent the last 10 years living and working in the Middle East, where I mainly focused on conflict analysis, aid worker security, and humanitarian access. And so part of that kind of very much exposed me to, rows and rows of conflict data that also contained information about explosive munitions. And so while I was working for a British organization, the International NGO Safety Organization, some of that data that we were providing to humanitarian mine action organizations was very helpful to them because it contained explosive munitions. And so I got the idea of the project basically when I read an advocacy report by Humanity and Inclusion, HI, that looked at kind of conflict data or explosive munition data in Syria. And I realized that actually the data kind of was perhaps a bit skewed a little bit because it recorded conflict events rather than the number of explosive munitions in that. And so that started a chain of events where I did a test case for a few organizations and then joined the Carter Center kind of in 2018 till 2020, where I kind of brought this project to life there with them. And then since then, I've moved on and I'm currently kind of a humanitarian educator around the New England area. I've moved to the US, but that's a very kind of brief background about me. Christoph?
Thank you, Johnny. Yeah, so my background is also in conflict studies and conflict analysis. I did a master's degree at King's College back in 2019, and then right thereafter, I joined the Carter Center as sort of a research intern. And this is where I got introduced to the project, which was at that moment running already. But I think I really took a liking to working with the data, and I immediately started seeing what the idea could really offer to other organizations. And this is why I got very, very involved, even beyond my time with the Carter Center. And since then, I have moved on to UN OCHA, where I work with the Central Emergency Response Fund on the anticipatory action portfolio, which is still like a very data-driven process and work, but more in the humanitarian response sort of segment and not as much in the analytical field.
Let's get into talking about your article. Let's go ahead and clarify what verified conflict data is. So if you could just briefly talk about what it is and why it's important.
So verified conflict data, at least in the way that we have defined it, is data that contains person-confirmed, known to be true information, or in other words, it's data whose accuracy and consistency has been confirmed by a trusted person or organization. So in conflict settings such as Syria, the military, a humanitarian organization, or a journalistic outlet, and typically this data details the type of conflict an area has experienced, the ammunition and weapons used in the area, as well as the intensity of fighting. And given its relatively high level of accuracy, verified conflict data is essential to making evidence-based decisions, which is why it has a lot of value for humanitarians and also mine action organizations, because it's what they base their operational and strategic thinking on. The problem with verified data, however, is that often it can be really, really difficult to obtain and to process. And this is not just due to the fact that information gathering in conflict settings is always difficult, compromised by access and security constraints. No, in certain conflicts where there are hundreds of distinct events each day, which was also the case for Syria at the heights of the conflict, it's also just a capacity issue. So basically, whoever tries to verify data simply can't keep up. And also there's the possibility that data can't easily be shared between organizations or released because of its potential implications on the fighting and the conflict itself. So there's an ethical dimension even to it. And in these settings, where the depth and granularity of verified data is simply not good enough to base decisions on, we encourage organizations to turn to other data sets, for example, social media and open source data, not to replace, but to augment the verified information that is available at that given time. So yeah, given that it's not verified, open source data has its limitations. For instance, there are questions about its reliability and it needs to be processed with care. But what's great about it also is that there's generally just a lot of it. So for instance, Twitter messages are generated, in just a pace that can very hardly be replicated. And when aggregated, it can offer insights that a limited amount of verified data just cannot. At least this was sort of the thinking that guided the project at the Carter Center that Johnny and I both were a part of, because what we did was use a Carter Center maintained data set consisting of tens of thousands of entries on the Syrian conflict, dating back years, and most of them not verified, to get a better idea of not just where explosive munitions were used throughout the conflict, but also what kind and how many. And what we did was to extrapolate this information, a lot of it manually, and then we geotagged it as accurately as possible if it wasn't geotagged already by partners such as ACLED. And based on all that work, what we did was to make what we think are reasonable assumptions about UXO concentration in various administrative areas throughout the country, down to the town and village level. And we really hope that our findings can be useful as a resource for especially humanitarian mine action organizations, because with their limited resources and with limited access, our findings could really help them make decisions now on where to do further technical surveys or where to prioritize field work whenever certain parts of the country become accessible, because currently most of Syria is still closed off. And our thinking really was, we want to start thinking about this immense problem now, because maybe we can make some headway now already and not just when the country actually opens up again. So yeah, we're hopeful that we've done this, and we're excited to get feedback on it from more practitioners once we put this out there publicly.
So the method in your article looks at the number and general category of explosive munitions mentioned within a conflict event. And you kind of touched on this briefly, but can you talk why it's important to look at the number and general category of explosives as opposed to just looking at the overall conflict event?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned with that report that I saw back in 2018, I noticed that, although it was very helpful to show where, conflict events where explosive munitions had occurred were kind of mapped, and it showed, high areas of that and low areas of that. When I kind of delved down into the data, I realized that it was perhaps misrepresenting the actual scale of it, because the method that we subsequently developed that kind of was born out of this was we realized that the same conflict event can contain wildly different counts of explosive munitions. So, for example, on one conflict line, one conflict event, it could say one airstrike struck village A, whereas the next line down could say 100 artillery shells struck village B, but both would be recorded as a single conflict event. And obviously there's a huge discrepancy between explosive munitions between the two areas, and over kind of thousands upon thousands of conflict events, that really kind of increases. And so, just to put that into perspective, with the Carter Center data, we recorded around 65,000 lines of data and managed to extrapolate out 267,000 individual uses of explosive munitions. So that's a pretty sizable difference. And so hopefully this method can help kind of give a bit more clarity and granularity to it.
This has operational but also strategic implications, because ultimately we can, through this methodology, provide political entities, especially donors, with a much clearer picture of the scope and scale of the problem at hand. And we can then compare it to other contexts. For instance, in Mozambique, how long did it actually take to discard and demine certain areas? How much time did it take to get rid of 30,000 explosives? And by that we can just give a little bit better information on the requirements that are going to be needed, or the resources that are going to be needed to get this done. And I think that can be helpful, because better information hopefully leads to better decision making.
I know in Mine Action, funding is an ever-present issue, and this certainly seems like a great tool to help organizations contextualize the scale of contamination, as you mentioned earlier. How might organizations use it to convince donors that work needs to be done here?
It can definitely, the tool can be used as a minimum baseline, in effect, that talks about the minimum number of explosive munitions used, and from that potentially estimating the number of munitions that failed, that turned into unexploded ordnance. Obviously there's a variety of factors there that contribute to the formation of unexploded ordnance. So it is a very basic tool, and we're not saying this is the exact number, but as that minimum baseline, it can be very helpful for donors to understand that. And then in addition to rubble clearance and other types of activity, it can start putting kind of a bit more meat to the bone, as it were, with what's needed from that donor level to help with clearance. In terms of like operational level with demining organizations, it can really be used in a number of areas, primarily as a risk assessment for staff, humanitarian mine action staff from organizations going into an area that perhaps they don't know, has it been heavily bombarded or not, and that can potentially help with the way that they prioritize their survey areas, because our data goes down to town level, and so they can really take a whole swath of an area, a region, a district, a province, and prioritize where they're going to go first to look at that. It can help with kind of where to identify non-technical surveys, risk education, and things like that, and planning operations well. So because this is open source data and freely available, it removes the politicization, unfortunately, that is ever present in the humanitarian mine action sector, competition of funding, or who's getting the best information to kind of work in certain areas. And so this very much tries to kind of transcend that and be helpful, basically.
And maybe one quick addition, we hope that even when Syria becomes more accessible, that HMA actors will return to this data set, because I think it could be really helpful also when used together with other data. So when it's overlaid with other data, for instance, what are the key infrastructure points? What does returns look like? So basically, when we know people are returning to a specific area, or there are roads that people need to go through to access certain resources, then maybe a decision can be made to clear certain parts first, and our data set can really help understand sort of what is necessary to do that. That's also one layer. And I think, it's great now while Syria mostly is not accessible, but I think it even has use once, mine action organizations can move into the country, and then they can return and compare their data on the ground to what we have seen before, and so on and so forth. And all of that will help calibrate, our methodology a lot more as well.
Do you know of anyone else who's currently looking at conflict data in this way? What kind of other organizations are using your method?
So I know that the Halo Trust are using or have used it, because I did a short consultancy with them in Yemen to begin this idea with them. And in terms of using conflict data in the mine action area and kind of using machine learning and AI to help with the collection and sorting of that data. The only kind of entity that I've seen that's quite kind of could be quite connected to this is the University of Heidelberg. They have an AI machine learning team there. And certainly, you know, we're hoping to connect with them in the future. And certainly, you know, when this current phase of the project is finished, we're still waiting for one more final report to come out from the Carter Center that will kind of summarize the whole country. We're missing kind of two provinces at the moment, but once those provinces are kind of filled in, I think that will kind of really, you know, be very helpful to a lot of mine action actors, and then it'll just kind of be updated after that. But yeah, the University of Heidelberg is certainly the kind of one that we've seen.
How would you go about finding an event? Like, are these news sources online or?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mixture of a few things. I mean, in the early days, the Carter Center collected its own data through interns and researchers, both in Arabic and English. And that was from a variety of open source news sources. But later on, from 2018 onwards, it used ACLED data, which I think everyone is familiar with, ACLED conflict data. And so they kind of obviously have a robust collection mechanism as well in terms of open source data, local news, Arabic, English as well. Yeah, so it's a kind of mixture of all that really. There's one or two kind of events that we were kind of informed by humanitarians, but yeah, the vast majority is very much kind of open source data from conflict events. And so, but we hope to add to the data set, you know, as Christoph mentioned, you know, the Twitter side of things, sentiment analysis, Facebook, trying to kind of hoover up some of the data there, and then also kind of visual kind of aids, satellite mapping and things like that would be, I think, a next step as well. But yeah, at the moment, open source data from kind of ACLED and other kind of open source media outlets. Yeah.
And maybe just to add to that very quickly, you know, ACLED is fantastic at, you know, providing this type of data, but also the Carter Center, you know, really needs to be commended for, you know, checking the accuracy of what they receive from ACLED every week, and then even scoping sort of sources online to see if there's anything that has been missed. And I understand that the Carter Center has even sent this back to ACLED to, you know, improve sort of their data evaluation processes. So it is actually quite thorough, and there is sort of, you know, people trying to verify, and, you know, ACLED also, you know, uses a lot of, you know, things that they take from Twitter or that other people have previously taken from Twitter, and then they code it into Excel files and so on. But yes, it's really impressive, and, you know, those organizations need to be commended for doing incredible work in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good like symbiotic relationship almost. And so, you know, ACLED obviously have data from many different contexts around the world, and we're definitely keen to kind of expand that and, you know, maybe look at Ukraine, Yemen, Libya and other places where kind of conflict data is being recorded. And also like thinking about the future, you know, sadly, the next conflict, wherever that may be, you know, will likely also be heavily kind of recorded in the open source sphere. So I think we'll, you know, if we can get the methodology down now, I think it can really help for future kind of contexts.
So for Syria, you mentioned that the data is split up into 4 categories: into air-launched, ground-launched, cluster carrier, and IEDs and landmines. What category of explosive was most characteristic of the Syrian conflict, or can you tell that from what you found?
I'm going to hedge my bets a little bit here because, you know, as Johnny mentioned, the Carter Center has published 4 total reports covering most of the country, but there's still a 5th report pending, also delayed by the pandemic. But there's really interesting insights already that, for instance, different munitions were used more and less in different areas. So, for instance, 64% of all munitions recorded in the northeast of Syria were air-launched, meaning either from a helicopter or warplane, whereas this type of munition was only used in 38% of all recorded cases in Damascus and rural Damascus. But really, to promote this a little bit, the beauty of our report and of our data set is that it allows us to filter and drill down by region, munition category, munition type, and so on. So if you, for instance, were interested in looking at how many cluster munitions were used or anti-tank missiles were used in, for example, Aleppo, you could easily find this out. And you can filter by the various categories. We have 21 munition types that you can search for, and all of this is also mapped in ArcGIS, so it's really accessible also from a visual standpoint. So I'll leave that my answer, and I'll give you the answer on how much each munition type was used according to our data set once we have all the data available.
You mentioned briefing various HMA organizations, and you talked about this earlier. You currently partnering with anyone right now, or do you have any plans to partner with HMA organizations in particular countries?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, we haven't kind of officially partnered with organizations and had more of an unofficial relationship, but certainly, briefed back in, I want to say, the end of 2019. The UNMAS Humanitarian Mine Action Service had a working group on Syria. And so I briefed this methodology when I was still at the Carter Center to them. And that certainly kind of widened the interest in this. But certainly the Halo Trust, MAG, even the White Helmets, have all kind of had kind of varying degrees of connection with this project, and still we're still connecting with them and collaborating with them where we can, but certainly not as any official memorandum of understanding or anything like that. But we welcome kind of connections with us, and certainly are more than happy to kind of share the methodology, the tool, with whoever might need it.
Are there any parting thoughts you guys would like to share with the community before we wrap up? Are there any final statements, so to speak?
I know that some people, when I've initially proposed this project and presented this project, get quite, they react to it quite strongly because they think it's replacing verified data or replacing current and existing ways of doing things. And that's not our intention at all. Our intention is very much this project augments their existing activities and is very much used as a substitute when there isn't available information or whatever it might be, and especially in those initial stages of mine action activity, as well as kind of promoting up to donors in advocacy. So that's if people have listened to all this and still have queries and questions, that would be my parting shot, that we're very much here to we want to assist and help with what they're doing rather than replace or change what they're doing.